here now, and now I guess I need to stop sharing my screen and give him the right.
Thank you, everyone. First, I just wanted to thank Zichen, but I still can't share my screen. I'm still trying, and it still says it's disabled. At any rate, while Zichen is helping, I just wanted to say a quick thank you for letting me present, even though I'm live. I got the information a bit late and managed to cancel my tickets because we went virtual. Zichen, it's still disabled. Zichen?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm working on it.
Thanks. Aha, there we go. Good news. We're going. Okay, thank you again so much for letting me present. Again, I only got the information a little late regarding the change of the conference to virtual format. My name is Sarah Marie Jordaan. I am a professor at Johns Hopkins University with my primary appointment in School of Advanced International Studies and secondary appointment in environmental health and engineering. And so I'm going to be presenting on global mitigation opportunities for the life cycle of gas-fired power. So there's a lot of questions about whether or not natural gas can serve as a bridge fuel. And that's primarily, this juxtaposing the fact that in comparison to coal, the emissions are lower. However, at the same time, it does present a situation of carbon lock-in over the next, up to 40 plus years if a plant is constructed. So there's a lot of questions regarding whether or not this can actually serve as a bridge fuel. So these different perspectives really bring a lot of questions forward, particularly because of the natural gas supply chain. So what this presentation looks at is some work that I've been doing with some of my colleagues. And what we were really interested in asking is how low can the emissions associated with natural gas actually be, and does this make a difference in terms of the overall mitigation and contributing towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions? So across the life cycle of natural gas-fired power, so that's all the way from materials extraction through waste disposal, there are a number of different mitigation options that are broadly acknowledged. For example, methane capture, leak reduction across the supply chain, carbon capture and storage, increasing power plant efficiencies, ameliorating grid efficiencies, so that would be reducing transmission and distribution losses in the power grid. And of course, different configurations of all of these mitigation options. So this analysis looks at the life cycle and then also determines what the mitigation potential is. So just to revisit life cycle assessment again, it is a cradle to grave assessment, so looks at the environmental burdens from materials extraction through waste disposal. In this case, it's specifically focused on greenhouse gas emissions, and with this scope, it's analogous to carbon footprinting, which is a subset of LCA. LCA is a technology assessment tool that works as decision support. So this little diagram here shows a nice depiction of the general concept, the method shown right here, and this is what an overall model looks like with the inputs and outputs of the different stages. So what we were interested in this question, so if we're looking at mitigation options, examining the life cycle provides a lot of interesting information. But what it doesn't address is the fact that mitigation options are generally tied to different jurisdictions. So what we decided to do was to do a life cycle emissions intensity analysis and then look at how these emissions are distributed geographically across countries. So the model that we developed, this is what we have included within the model. So the system's boundaries show everything that is within the model. So we have the upstream emissions associated with materials extraction, all the way through construction, of fuel cycle plant operation. And then the fuel cycle includes production, gathering, storage, processing, and transmission with all these subcomponents. And that goes towards plant operation either through pipelines, and that would be the combustion emissions, or it might be transported through liquefied natural gas. So that would include the components of the life cycle associated with LNG, so liquefied natural gas. And then we look at the electricity delivered. So we also include the grid inefficiencies. So that would obviously create a situation where there would be compensatory generation and additional emissions associated with that compensatory generation. And then, of course, taking it a step farther, there are all kinds of different mitigation options. So looking at the more prevalent methane capture, grid inefficiencies, carbon capture and storage, and I'll get into those as I present the results. Now, looking at all countries across the world from a global perspective, we relied on a number of different data sources because we really wanted to get a geographically textured analysis. So we looked at power plant efficiencies. So we have the country level efficiencies for natural gas power plants, but we also took it a step farther and included the combined heat and power. So we compared to the power plants only to the power plants with the combined heat and power. And we served to allocate the emissions associated with an EPA methodology. And that was using International Energy Agency data. Then we looked at imports and exports. So we wanted to ensure that we were accounting for the proportion of natural gas that was coming in through liquefied natural gas, as well as pipelines. So we proportionally allocated the amount of emissions associated with each. Then we have the production and consumption associated with natural gas. Then we also, and I believe that was also supplemented with BP's data. Then we also have electricity generation, which we also obtained from the International Energy Agency, T&D losses from the Energy Information Administration. Then we combine this with the Environmental Protection Agency. We examined global country level methane emissions, and in order to come to this decision, we compared versus other global data sources, including UNFCCC, for example, as well as the International Energy Agency, and this one turned out to be the most comprehensive in terms of the amount of countries that were covered. And we also looked at the upstream carbon dioxide emissions associated with the production of the natural gas production systems. So I'll start stepping through some of the results. So for all countries that were involved with different stages of the life cycle of natural gas, we quantified the life cycle emissions intensity, accounting for the scope that I previously accounted for. And what you'll see here, similar to the International Energy Agency, the vast majority of the life cycle emissions estimates are lower than that of coal, which sits at around 1,000 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour, with a few outliers. In our analysis, this was the outliers are based on low power plant efficiency combined with high methane emissions reports. And those two countries that are the highest are Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. And then going all the way through all the countries that become lower, with global average around 600 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour. And of course, this is geographically dispersed in terms of having heterogeneous, as we've seen in the prior presentations, emissions based on the country level factors such as power plant efficiency, as well as other aspects related to methane leaks and where the natural gas is coming from. We then said, well, if you take a look at the emissions from each of these countries, it's really challenging to determine what each country's responsibilities are, how we can possibly reduce the emissions associated with the natural gas supply chain if you don't quantify the emissions in each of the countries. So what we decided to do is we decided to say, okay, if you have a kilowatt hour of electricity generated from each country, for example, what would be, so we took those and we did the life cycle emissions estimate, and then we quantified by country the emissions associated with each. So over 1 year, if you look at all the life cycle emissions associated with each kilowatt hour that was delivered, we determined that these emissions associated with the life cycle of gas-fired power amount to over 3.6 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent every year. And 84% of this comes from the electricity generation component when you're looking at total emissions. Now, interestingly, if you start to examine the different mitigation options, of course, each of them have different amount of mitigation that they can actually contribute. So what we determined was that everything combined, there's a potential for 2.5 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent every year to be reduced through applying all mitigation options together. So that's substantial. So what we did was for each of these mitigation options, so if you look at the top two panels, for example, these are associated with just, sorry, 1 second, I have a dog who is making some noise. Apologies. So if you look at the top two panels, these are the mitigations options associated with the options that are not carbon capture and storage. So this would be reducing methane leakage, also reducing the other upstream emissions, reducing electricity transmission and distribution losses, pipeline leaks, and power plant efficiencies, and examining the total. So over 100-year global warming potentials without carbon capture and storage, we determined that 19% of emissions that are released in 1 year for the life cycle of each kilowatt hour delivered, or total kilowatt hours delivered, about 19% can be reduced. Now, there is still a substantial contribution that can come from carbon capture and storage. So we determined that with carbon capture and storage, this can be increased to 70% of emissions, which can then be abated. Now, it's of course very contentious regarding the potential opportunity for there to be shorter term climate impacts associated with higher global warming potential greenhouse gas emissions such as methane. So we also examined cases where with a 20-year global warming potential with and without CCS. And we found that the methane leakage component does make a difference. If you look at the top right-hand figure, then you'll see that there is an additional 7% that can be reduced if you're looking over shorter time frames. So of course does make a difference, but still the carbon capture and storage you'll see makes the largest contribution. Now, we, of course, are dealing with large data sets that are highly uncertain. So we then conducted a sensitivity analysis. So the top two figures are associated with the total emissions. So this would be looking at the total global emissions over 1 year, and then associated with the life cycle of each kilowatt hour of electricity delivered combined. And then the bottom two figures are looking at the emissions intensities. So what you'll see is that if you're looking over 100-year global warming potentials, the results are most sensitive to power plant efficiency and transmission and distribution losses. But the impact of the methane emissions, of course, gets much larger if you start to consider 20-year global warming potentials. Now, what we're right now considering, if you look at the optimistic baseline and pessimistic estimates on the bottom, our more pessimistic estimates is about 5%. Now, there have been recent studies that have come out showing particularly for low productivity wells that this may stand higher. So we're also going to be considering one scenario that represents the potential impact of these particular wells where the methane leaks can be over 10%. So for low productivity wells, that was a Nature Communications paper that just came out. So that's one thing we are considering right now. So overall, the contributions that we have based on this analysis, first we have presented an analysis of mitigation opportunities globally, but at the country scale, so including all producing and consuming, all countries associated with the life cycle of natural gas-fired power. And what we really show is the national opportunities for decarbonizing gas-fired power to the highest degree that it can. We also contribute a concise synthesis of data gaps and uncertainties. So that's something that we've included within the paper, which is right now under consideration. And so we include things, for example, like the potential contributions of improved sensors and satellites for methane emissions, and also noting that the costs, for example. So policy recommendations, clearly there's a need to improve the performance of the data collection, reporting, and accounting, better understand, for example, methane leaks, and to make them consistent, because there are several data sets that could be more comprehensive in terms of their coverage of different countries, and also to ensure consistency across reporting. So we are in the middle of completing the critique of present inventories and improving on our sensitivity analysis. So just to conclude, what mitigation can really play a large role in examining the potential solutions associated with decarbonizing natural gas, but we do still risk lock-in, and these do have costs associated with them. For example, carbon capture and storage is typically expected to have costs on the order of $50 to $100 per ton CO2. But substantial emissions can be avoided. I reported the 2.5 gigatons per year, but we also have completed an analysis that shows that if you apply all of these mitigation options between now and 2050, or a more ambitious scenario where they were all applied to gas-fired generation by 2035, then you can actually mitigate on the order of 46 and 70 gigatons of CO2 equivalent during those timeframes. And that would be a gradual scaling up. Now, of course, policy oversight is a critical parameter, which really points to the need to couple life cycle emissions analysis with jurisdictional analysis to better understand where the emissions are actually occurring and how they can necessarily be reduced. And I'm just going to note that future research should seek to include this differentiation of environmental impacts and responsibilities to ensure that life cycle emissions can be mitigated. It helps to know what they are, but we of course want to ensure that the responsibilities are noted. And I just want to end on the last note. This, of course, is a life cycle approach focused specifically on greenhouse gas emissions. And there are, of course, always other sustainability metrics that are important to ensuring a sustainable energy future. I just did want to make a quick thank you for the number of awards from Hopkins that have helped to support this work, and also to my collaborators, particularly Andrew Redinger, who really was a co-lead in this analysis and contributed substantially to the work. He's now working with the Natural Resources Canada. Thank you so much. I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you, Sarah, for the great talk. Is there any questions?
I think Stephen Bryant.
Zichin, Stephen here. I've got a question. Sarah, nice talk. It's an interesting study. Am I interpreting correctly that second last bullet, you can take care of, let's say, about 2/3 of the natural gas-fired power plant emissions. And is that pretty much the floor or the ceiling, depending on which way you look at it? Where I'm headed is, does this indicate some of the hard to abate emissions for which we'll need carbon dioxide removal technologies? So if you could talk about what are the limits on what can be done at a reasonable cost, or how where you got to that number. Thank you.
That's right. No, this is a great point. You know, so can't we make it completely zero? I mean, that would obviously be the best case. With the parasitic load associated with CCS and the fact that it can't abate all emissions, that's where the remaining emissions come from. We also we didn't include we didn't zero everything out. We just made estimates. Okay, so how much can we improve efficiency? How much can we, you can't say you would have zero T&D losses, for example. So Singapore, for example, is the lowest transmission and distribution losses in our data set for obvious reasons, because everything's close together and a very high population, right? So not everywhere looks like that. So there's of course some areas where you can't completely improve and zero everything out. And of course the fact that CCS won't capture every single emission, we use prior analysis to make some estimates regarding what would be reasonable, and then also made sure to include the parasitic load, which we included an investigation of if you can improve the overall efficiency of CCS as well. Thank you. Micah?
Yes, I had a question that stems from the sensitivity analysis. You pointed out that it was very sensitive to power plant efficiency, and in your optimistic scenario, you had 85% power plant efficiency. Is there something in that in terms of, what technologies we should focus on that could hit those efficiency targets in terms of what we could see from natural gas's impacts going forward?
Yeah, how is that efficiency possible? So we actually spent some time looking at different combined heat and power options. So our first analysis actually didn't even include combined heat and power. Ultimately, we found enormous differences when you started to include the efficiency gains with CHP. Of course, so then we had to include a whole bunch of different allocation between each, which was essentially backing out boiler efficiencies. But these were, if you take a look at the International Energy Agency reports on high level, the high end of the range for combined heat and power, you'll see that there are some that range as high as that.
Thank you. That's great.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Zichan, especially for letting me present, because I missed the emails. So thank you everyone for your time and patience.